the hidden horror behind hallucinations. They say you're safe inside your own mind, but what if that's the biggest lie of all? Last night, Grace saw her bedroom mirror ripple like water, and when she looked closer, her reflection smiled back. She hasn't slept since, and after tonight, neither will you. Grace sat on the edge of her bed, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, the room suffocating her with its unnatural stillness. The thin cotton sheets beneath her were damp, clinging to her skin as though they, too, were alive and unwilling to let her go. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, each exhale forming a faint mist in the cold, stale air. The night was supposed to be quiet, peaceful even, but something was wrong. The kind of wrong that seeped into her bones, that gnawed at her mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved her. It was the oppressive weight of it, as if the entire house were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The faint scent of mildew wafted into her nostrils, sharp and sour, mingling with the coppery tang of her own sweat. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to cling to every surface, coating the walls, the floor, even her own skin. Grace tried to convince herself it was nothing, maybe an old pipe leaking somewhere or the remnants of a forgotten damp towel. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that. The smell felt deliberate, like it wanted her to notice, to acknowledge its presence. Her eyes flicked to the mirror across the room, her heart skipping a beat as she caught the faintest shimmer ripple across its surface. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop of rain. She froze, her body locking in place as her mind scrambled to make sense of what she'd just seen. Mirrors don't ripple. That's impossible. She stared at her reflection, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But then her reflection did something that shattered whatever fragile reassurance she'd clung to. It tilted its head. Not the way she did, not in the same direction. It moved of its own accord, its glassy eyes narrowing as though it were studying her, examining her. Grace's breath hitched, her chest tightening as if an invisible hand had wrapped around her lungs. She blinked hard, once, twice, and when she opened her eyes, the reflection was back to normal. Her own face stared back at her, pale and gaunt, her dark hair clinging to her damp forehead. But the damage was already done. The image of that warped, alien version of herself was burned into her mind, vivid and unshakable. It's just exhaustion, she thought, though the words rang hollow in her mind. She hadn't been sleeping well for weeks, plagued by dreams that weren't quite nightmares, but left her waking up feeling drained, as though something had been siphoning her energy while she slept. Her therapist had called it stress-induced insomnia, handed her a prescription, and sent her on her way. But no amount of pills could fix what she felt now. She reached for her phone, desperate for the comforting glow of the screen, for the connection to the outside world it promised. The device felt cold and lifeless in her trembling hands as she unlocked it, the light casting eerie shadows across the room. She scrolled through her messages, her thumb pausing on one from Rachel, her best friend. They'd texted earlier that evening, just the usual back and forth about work and weekend plans. But as Grace stared at the screen, her stomach dropped. There was a new message, one she didn't remember sending. Don't trust it. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The timestamp was from hours ago, but she had no memory of typing those words. Her hands shook as she reread the message, her mind racing with questions. Was it a glitch? A prank? She tried to rationalize it, but the more she stared at the text, the more a sickening sense of dread crept over her. She tapped the screen, intending to text Rachel and explain the bizarre situation, but as her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the screen flickered. Her message thread disappeared, replaced by a single line of text. "Why are you ignoring me?" The phone buzzed violently in her hand, the vibration almost painful against her skin. Grace yelped, dropping it onto the bed where it continued to hum and shake, the screen glitching wildly. Static-like lines danced across the display, and beneath the faint whirring of the vibration, she heard something else. A whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, like the faint rustle of leaves in a distant wind. But as she stared at the phone, the sound grew louder, sharper, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony that made her head throb. The words were garbled, impossible to understand, but one thing was clear. They were speaking to her. Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat as a cold sweat broke out across her skin. She snatched the phone off the bed and hurled it across the room, where it hit the wall with a sickening crack and fell silent. But the whispers didn't stop. They were no longer coming from the phone. They were inside her head, worming their way into her thoughts, invading her mind like an infection. Grace clutched her temples, pressing her palms against her skull as though she could physically push the voices out. They hissed her name, drawing it out in a way that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. She whimpered, tears streaming down her face as the room seemed to close in around her. The walls felt closer, the air heavier, as if the house itself were alive and feeding off her fear. Her eyes darted back to the mirror, and for a moment she thought she saw her reflection move again. But this time, it didn't stop. It was smiling. The kind of smile that didn't belong on a human face, wide and unnatural, stretching far beyond what was physically possible. Her reflection raised a hand and placed it flat against the glass, its fingers impossibly long and thin. Grace stared, paralyzed, as the hand began to push against the surface of the mirror. The glass rippled like water, bending and warping as though it were no longer solid, and then the hand began to emerge. The hand pushed further through the surface of the mirror, its long, bony fingers stretching unnaturally as if testing the air around them. The skin, if it could be called that, was a sickly gray, glistening as though wet, with veins of black pulsating just beneath the surface. Grace couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, her muscles locked by a primal terror that she couldn't shake. Her mind screamed at her to run, to scream, to do something, but the commands died before reaching her limbs. The whispers in her head had grown louder, more distinct now, their cadence like a twisted nursery rhyme. The voices overlapped in a dizzying chant, words slipping in and out of coherence. Let it in. You see it now. Let it in. The sound didn't just echo in her mind. It vibrated through her entire body, each syllable burrowing deeper into her consciousness like shards of glass. She blinked, and in that split second, the hand was gone. The mirror was normal again, reflecting her wide-eyed face, pale and glistening with sweat. The room felt different, though. The air was thicker, heavier, and a faint hum seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Grace stood slowly, her knees trembling as she forced her legs to obey. She approached the mirror with hesitant, shuffling steps, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She stopped just short of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It looked off. Her reflection's eyes seemed darker, deeper, as though the pupils had expanded to swallow the irises. Her hair was matted, more disheveled than it should have been, and her lips were pulled into a faint, unnatural smile that she wasn't making. She raised a hand to her face, and so did her reflection. But as she tilted her head slightly, her reflection didn't mimic the movement perfectly. It lagged. Grace stumbled back, her breath hitching as the whispers in her head surged louder, now screaming incoherent words in a deafening roar. She grabbed her phone from the floor, its cracked screen flickering weakly. Desperation clawed at her as she fumbled to call Rachel. The phone rang once, twice. Then a distorted voice answered, low and guttural, with an edge that sent chills racing down her spine. "She can't help you now." Grace screamed and threw the phone again, watching as it shattered against the wall. Her chest heaved as she backed away, her hands fumbling behind her to find the doorknob. She needed to get out of the room, out of the house, out of whatever this was. Her trembling fingers finally found the cold metal of the knob, and she twisted it violently, yanking the door open. But instead of the familiar hallway, she was met with complete darkness. Not the kind of darkness you find at night, with faint shadows and outlines illuminated by distant moonlight. This was an unnatural void, a blackness so deep it felt like it would swallow her whole. The air beyond the doorway felt alive, pulsating with a rhythmic hum that matched the whispers in her head. She slammed the door shut and turned back to the room, tears streaming down her face. She was trapped. The whispers were louder now, relentless, overlapping voices clawing at her sanity. The walls seemed closer than before, as if the room itself were shrinking, forcing her into the center. She pressed her back against the door, her nails digging into the wood as her breathing turned shallow. Then she heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the mirror. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers on glass. She turned her head toward it, her eyes wide with terror. The tapping stopped. For a moment all was silent, the whispers fading into the background like static. She let out a shaky breath, daring to hope that whatever had invaded her mind and her home was gone. But then the glass cracked. It wasn't a loud, shattering noise, but a subtle, creeping sound like ice fracturing under weight. A thin, jagged line appeared at the center of the mirror, spiderwebbing outward in slow motion. Grace stared, mesmerized, as the cracks formed a pattern. A spiral, almost like an eye, staring directly at her. The whispers returned louder than ever, and this time she understood the words. "You opened the door." The cracks in the mirror deepened, and from them seeped a thick black liquid that oozed down the surface like tar. The smell hit her first, pungent and acrid, like burning flesh mixed with decay. The liquid dripped onto the floor, pooling at the base of the mirror, and as she watched in horror, it began to move. The pool expanded, stretching toward her like it had a will of its own. She scrambled away, her hands slipping on the slick wood floor as she tried to distance herself from the encroaching blackness. But no matter how far she moved, it kept coming, inching closer, its surface bubbling and shifting as though something beneath it was trying to break free. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening noise, a low, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Grace clamped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face, her body trembling violently. The tar-like substance reached her feet, and she screamed as it wrapped around her ankles, cold and sticky, pulling her toward the mirror. She kicked and thrashed, but the more she struggled, the tighter its grip became. Her reflection in the mirror was smiling again, its wide, jagged grin stretching impossibly far as it mouthed two words. "Let go." The last thing Grace saw before her vision went dark was her reflection reaching out, its hand pressing against the glass as though to pull her in. The darkness swallowed her whole. Grace had no sense of time, no up or down, just an infinite, crushing void. It wasn't the kind of darkness one experiences when closing their eyes or turning off the lights. This was suffocating, alive, pressing against her skin and filling her lungs like liquid tar. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The silence was absolute, and the absence of noise was more horrifying than the whispers had been. Her senses felt disoriented, as if she were being stretched across some unseen plane, her body and mind separating inch by agonizing inch. Then out of the silence came the faintest sound, a low, wet squelching, like something thick and viscous being dragged across the floor. Grace's ears strained to locate it, though she couldn't see anything. Her heart pounded, a wild, erratic rhythm as the sound grew louder, closer, slithering toward her. She instinctively tried to move, to run, but her limbs felt heavy, as though they were submerged in quicksand. The weight pressing down on her chest intensified, forcing her breaths to come in shallow gasps. Just as the sound seemed to reach her, the darkness around her shifted, almost imperceptibly. Shapes began to form in the void, faint, indistinct outlines that flickered like static on a dying TV. Grace blinked, her eyes struggling to focus, though she wasn't sure if they were even open. The shapes became clearer, towering figures with elongated limbs, their bodies bending at unnatural angles. Their heads tilted in grotesque ways, their necks twisting as though their bones had been replaced with soft clay. And then she saw their faces, or what should have been faces, where there should have been eyes, mouths, or even a semblance of humanity. There was only emptiness. Smooth, featureless skin stretched over their skulls, blank and expressionless. Yet Grace could feel them watching her, their attention like a tangible weight bearing down on her soul. It wasn't just sight, it was a deep, invasive awareness, as though they were peeling back the layers of her mind, exposing every fear, every insecurity, every hidden corner of her psyche. "Who are you?" Grace managed to whisper, though her voice sounded foreign, muffled, as if it were coming from underwater. The figures didn't respond. Instead, one of them moved closer, its body jerking in unnatural, stop-motion-like movements. The closer it came, the colder the air around her became, the chill seeping into her bones and leaving her teeth chattering. Her muscles tightened, every fiber of her being screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figure stopped inches from her, its faceless head tilting down to meet her gaze. Grace tried to avert her eyes, but she couldn't. Something unseen held her in place, forcing her to stare into the void where its eyes should have been. Her mind buzzed with static, her thoughts scattering like leaves in a violent wind. And then, without warning, the figure spoke. But it wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. The sound bypassed her ears entirely, resonating directly in her skull. It was deep, guttural, layered with countless other voices, all speaking in unison. "You invited us," it said, each word stretching out unnaturally, as if it were being dragged from the depths of some ancient abyss. "I didn't," Grace started, but the figure cut her off, its elongated arm snapping up with inhuman speed. A single finger, unnaturally long and thin, hovered just over her lips, silencing her. The touch never came, but the threat was enough to send a fresh wave of terror coursing through her. "You opened the door." The voice continued, colder now, each syllable digging into her mind like a shard of ice. "You saw the signs, you felt the pull, and still, you let us in." Grace shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't open anything. I didn't want this." The figure tilted its head further, its blank face almost touching hers. "Liar," it hissed, the words slithering into her mind like venom. The other figures began to close in now, their movements synchronized, their towering forms casting shadows that shouldn't have existed in the lightless void. They circled her, their presence oppressive, their silence more terrifying than the voice. And then, she saw it. At the center of the circle, just beneath her feet, the void began to ripple, the darkness swirling like ink dropped in water. A shape began to emerge, rising slowly from the depths. It was her. Her own face stared back at her, but it wasn't right. The features were twisted, exaggerated, as though someone had taken her image and warped it beyond recognition. Its eyes were too wide, its smile too sharp, its skin too pale. It looked like a caricature of herself, a mockery of her humanity. The doppelganger smiled, its mouth stretching impossibly wide to reveal rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. "You're starting to remember," it said, its voice identical to hers but dripping with malice. "Remember what?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. The figures surrounding her laughed, a deep guttural sound that reverberated through the void. The laughter grew louder, overlapping, until it was deafening. The doppelganger stepped closer, its glassy eyes locking onto hers. "You invited us in," it said, its tone taunting, almost playful. "You thought it was just a game, a harmless ritual, but we don't play fair." Grace's mind reeled, fragments of forgotten memories flashing before her eyes. A dark room, a circle of candles, a piece of paper with strange symbols scrawled on it. She had done it as a joke, a drunken dare with friends who had long since disappeared from her life. She hadn't believed in any of it. She hadn't thought it would work. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That was years ago. It didn't mean anything. It was just enough." The voice boomed, cutting her off. The doppelganger's face twisted into a snarl, its features contorting further until it was barely recognizable as human. "You called us, and now you belong to us." The figures closed in, their faceless forms towering over her. The darkness around her thickened, pressing against her skin, her mouth, her eyes, until she could no longer breathe. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her own distorted face, grinning as it whispered, "You should have never opened the door." Grace woke with a violent gasp, her body flinching as if pulled from deep water. For a brief, blissful moment, she thought she was safe, that the nightmare was over. But then she noticed the stillness, the oppressive silence that swallowed everything around her. She was lying on something cold and damp, her fingers brushing against a surface that felt like stone, slick with moisture. She opened her eyes, expecting the warm glow of sunlight or even the faint flicker of a lamp. But there was nothing. No light. No warmth. Just the same choking darkness that had consumed her before. Her breaths came shallow and fast, each one echoing faintly in the vast emptiness surrounding her. She reached out, her trembling hands patting the ground around her, searching for something, anything, that could anchor her to reality. The surface beneath her was uneven, jagged in some places, smooth in others, like the inside of a cavern. A faint metallic scent lingered in the air, sharp and acrid, mingling with something far worse, a putrid, rotting odor that made her stomach churn. As her fingers traced the ground, they brushed against something soft and damp. She recoiled instantly, her heart hammering in her chest. Her mind raced, conjuring images of decayed flesh, of things long dead and left to rot in this lightless void. She forced herself to touch it again, her fingers trembling as they made contact. It was cloth. "Hello?" Her voice cracked, the word barely audible. It felt wrong to speak, as if the sound might summon something lurking in the shadows. She clutched the fabric, pulling it toward her. It was heavy, sodden with what felt like water, though the faint coppery tang that clung to her fingertips told her otherwise. Her hands worked frantically, exploring the object until she found its edges. A sleeve, a collar. It was a shirt. A horrible realization crept over her, cold and unrelenting. This wasn't just a shirt, it was a person. "Hey!" she shouted now, shaking the body with all her strength. Her voice echoed endlessly, swallowed by the cavernous space. The body didn't move, didn't respond. She groped for its face, feeling the contours of a jaw, the hollows of eyes, the curve of lips. It was cold, deathly cold. Her fingers lingered, waiting for some sign of life, a twitch, a breath, anything. But there was nothing. Panic surged through her, hot and blinding. She scrambled to her feet, nearly slipping on the wet stone. She tried to run, but her feet found no stable ground, slipping and stumbling as she moved blindly through the dark. Her hands stretched out in front of her, searching for walls, for barriers, for any sign of an exit. But the space seemed infinite, boundless, as though she were trapped in a void that defied logic. Then came the sound. It started as a faint murmur, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the stone beneath her feet. At first, she thought it might be her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, but it grew louder, sharper, taking on a rhythm that was both alien and eerily familiar. Voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. They overlapped, tangled together like threads in a web, creating a cacophony that made her head throb. "Stop it!" she screamed, covering her ears, but the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until they were all around her, inside her, tearing through her mind like claws raking against glass. And then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was worse. Grace stood frozen, her breath hitching in her throat. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break the oppressive stillness. But something held her in place, a presence she couldn't see but could feel, heavy and malevolent, pressing down on her from all sides. Grace. Her name echoed through the void, spoken in a voice she didn't recognize. It was deep and distorted, each syllable drawn out as if spoken through water. She turned instinctively, though there was no direction, no light to guide her. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of her own breathing, ragged and uneven. And then she saw it. A faint light appeared in the distance, so small and dim that she wasn't sure if it was real. But it was something, and that was enough. She moved toward it, her steps slow and tentative, each one echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing more of her surroundings. She was in a cavern, the walls jagged and glistening with moisture. Strange markings were etched into the stone, spirals and symbols that seemed to pulse faintly as she passed. The light led her to a doorway, a crude archway carved into the rock. Beyond it was a narrow corridor, lit by the same faint, flickering glow. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to run in the opposite direction. But where else could she go? There was nothing behind her but darkness and death. She stepped through the archway, the air growing colder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around her, the corridor narrowing until she could barely fit through. The light ahead flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to dance and writhe like living things. The whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder with each step. She tried to ignore them, to focus on the light, but they burrowed into her mind, filling her thoughts with images she couldn't escape. A figure hanging by its neck, its face twisted in agony. A woman clawing at her own eyes, blood streaming down her cheeks. A child, standing alone in the dark, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "No," she muttered, shaking her head as if she could dislodge the visions. "This isn't real. It's not real." But the whispers only laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down her spine. The light flickered again, and for a moment she thought she saw something standing at the end of the corridor. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, its arms stretched out as if to welcome her. She froze, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. "Grace," the voice called again, louder this time, closer. She turned to run, but the corridor behind her had vanished. The walls had closed in, trapping her in a space barely large enough to move. The light above her dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. And then, in the final moments before the darkness consumed her again, she felt it. A hand, cold and clammy, wrapping around her wrist. "Welcome back," the voice whispered, and the light went out. The hand around Grace's wrist tightened, its grip icy and unrelenting, as though it had crawled straight out of the grave to claim her. She tried to pull away, her entire body convulsing with panic, but it was useless. The darkness surrounding her was so absolute, so suffocating, that she couldn't even see her own limbs, let alone the thing holding her. Yet she could feel it. Its spindly, bone-thin fingers pressing into her skin, each digit impossibly long and tipped with sharp, jagged nails that threatened to pierce her flesh. Her mind screamed for her body to fight, to escape, but terror paralyzed her, rooting her to the spot as though her feet had been cemented to the cold stone beneath her. "Let go of me," she finally managed to choke out, her voice breaking in desperation. The response came not in words, but in a guttural, rasping breath that sounded impossibly close to her ear. It was wet, gurgling, like air passing through a throat full of blood. Grace turned her head sharply, expecting to feel hot breath on her skin, but there was nothing, only the oppressive chill of the cavern air. And yet, the presence was unmistakable, looming over her like a shadow come to life. The hand began to pull her, dragging her forward with a strength that made resistance futile. She stumbled, her legs barely able to keep up, her mind spinning with dread. It was leading her deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, away from the faint memory of the light she had been chasing. Her free hand reached out desperately, brushing against the cold, jagged walls in an attempt to anchor herself. But the walls felt wrong now, slick and pulsating, as though they were alive, as though the entire cavern had become some monstrous breathing entity intent on swallowing her whole. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct than before, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of agony and malice. Some spoke her name, elongating it into a guttural chant that echoed endlessly in the cavern. Others spoke in languages she didn't recognize, their words guttural and sharp, laced with venom. And then there were the screams, piercing, soul-shattering cries that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, rising and falling like waves crashing against jagged rocks. "Grace!" One voice finally broke through the cacophony, clear and commanding. It was a voice she recognized, her mother's. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. It couldn't be. Her mother had been dead for years, taken by a sudden heart attack that had left Grace shattered and alone. And yet the voice was unmistakable, carrying the same warmth and gentleness that had once been her anchor in a chaotic world. "Come closer, sweetheart," the voice called, its tone soothing and maternal. Grace's legs moved involuntarily, the grip on her wrist loosening just enough for her to stumble forward. The whispers seemed to fade, replaced by the sound of her mother's voice, calling to her with increasing urgency. "You're almost there, Grace. Keep going. I'm waiting for you." The darkness ahead began to shift, giving way to a faint golden glow. It was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive void that had surrounded her moments ago. Grace's heart ached with longing as she moved toward it, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to believe it was real, that somehow her mother was here, waiting to pull her out of this nightmare. But as she stepped closer, the glow began to take shape, revealing a figure standing in the center of the light. It was her mother, or at least it looked like her. She was dressed exactly as Grace remembered her, in the simple floral dress she used to wear while gardening. Her arms were outstretched, a gentle smile on her face. But something was wrong. Her mother's eyes were too wide, the whites gleaming unnaturally bright in the dim light. Her smile, though familiar, was stretched too far, pulling her lips into an unnatural, grotesque grin that revealed too many teeth. And her skin. It was pale, almost translucent, with veins spiderwebbing beneath the surface like cracks in fragile glass. "Come to me, Grace," the figure said, her voice still soft and inviting. But now there was something else beneath it, a subtle distortion, a faint, guttural undertone that made the hairs on the back of Grace's neck stand on end. "No," Grace whispered, taking a step back. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead, her body refusing to obey. "You're not real. You're not her." The figure tilted its head, its smile widening further until it seemed to split its face in two. "I've always been here, Grace. Always watching. Always waiting." The light around the figure began to shift, darkening and twisting until it was no longer warm and golden, but sickly and green, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the cavern walls. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Grace stumbled back, her foot catching on a jagged rock. She fell hard, the impact sending pain shooting up her spine. The figure loomed over her now, its grin impossibly wide, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. "You brought this on yourself," it said, its voice now a deep guttural growl. You opened the door, and now it won't close. As the figure reached for her, Grace felt the walls of the cavern closing in, the whispers and screams rising to a deafening crescendo. The air grew colder, thinner, until it felt like she was suffocating. Her vision blurred, the figure above her dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows and teeth and eyes. And then, just as the darkness threatened to consume her completely, she woke. She was back in her apartment, lying on the floor of her living room. The faint hum of the refrigerator buzzed in the background, and the morning sunlight streamed through the curtains. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare, a horrible, vivid dream. But then she saw the marks. They were on her wrist, deep and red, as though something had gripped her with inhuman strength. And on the wall, scrawled in a substance she didn't dare identify, was a single word: welcome. What if the real nightmare is only beginning? Subscribe now, before it's too late.